Good afternoon. It's Monday, the 10th of February 2020, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. Your host today, Mike Robinson, myself, Brian Gerrish, and we're also joined by David Scott. David, of course, bringing us northern exposure from north of the border, and I understand a bit of snow.
Yes, apparently. Now, a week or so ago, if you remember, Monsieur Barnier was giving phase 2 of the Brexit negotiations, or at least this is the future relationship part following Brexit. And well, he had really this to say, that there could be a free trade deal if competition is and remains open and fair. If fisheries are open to the EU, the UK fisheries are open to the EU for all breeds of fish, and if there's a suitable enforcement mechanism. Now, while he was this was being live streamed out last week, at one point during the live stream there was a big graphic was displayed behind him, but they didn't bother to show that on the live stream itself. Well, here it is, because of course all the focus is on the trade deal. But you'll notice this is the EU-UK Future Partnership Institutional Arrangements graphic, which he showed during that presentation. And it's split into two, the economic partnership and the security partnership. And we'll all notice that the mainstream press is absolutely focusing on the economic partnership and its level playing field. That is what we're aiming for, a level playing field. But in the security partnership, of course, is foreign, security and defence policy. And really, when it comes down to the deal, this is what it's all about. So let's have a look in a little bit more detail. So here's Mr. Barnier again. So this is what's in the deal, because he published a document which was laying out what the deal was. Boris, in his presentation a few minutes later, didn't bother saying very much. He was just using his usual rhetoric. But this is what the deal says. In the guidelines of 23rd of March 2018, the European Council restated the Union's determination to have as close a possible partnership with the United Kingdom in the future. According to these guidelines, such a partnership should cover trade and economic cooperation, as well as other areas, in particular the fight against terrorism and international crime, as well as security, defence and foreign policy. And as you read down through the document, it's just paragraph after paragraph: foreign policy, security and defence in this case. This one, we're talking about foreign policy, security and defence. This paragraph, we're talking about foreign policy, security and defence. This paragraph, we're talking about as well as security, defence and foreign policy. So we've changed the order around a little bit. That clearly makes it completely different. In this one, we're back to foreign policy, security and defence, and more foreign policy, security and defence. These are separate paragraphs in the document. Foreign policy, security and defence is everywhere in this. It is clearly extremely key part of how the EU envisages the future relationship with the UK. So they have a number of sections when it actually gets to the foreign policy, security and defence section within this document. This was all just the preamble up until now. So what are they talking about? Consultation and security. They're saying the envisaged partnership would enable structured consultations between the Union and the United Kingdom through the political dialogue and common foreign and security policy and common security and defence policy, as well as sectoral dialogues, and so it goes on. They talk about wanting to have alignment with the United Kingdom on sanctions policy. They talk about the envisaged partnership should establish a framework in line with existing rules to enable the United Kingdom to participate on a case-by-case basis and upon invitation by the Union in CSDP, that's Common Security and Defence Policy, missions and operations open to third countries. And they say under this framework and in the context of a CSDP mission or operation in which the United Kingdom participates, the envisaged partnership should provide for interaction and exchange of information with the UK that are proportionate to the level of the UK's contribution. And then they talk about defence capabilities development. The partnership would preserve the strategic autonomy and freedom of action of the Union, underpinned by its defence industrial base, where it is in the industrial and technological interest of the Union to facilitate the interoperability of the respective armed forces. The security partnership may enable, if and to the extent possible under EU law, and there are various options for this, including UK participation in PESCO, which of course is the operational part of the European Defence Union. Intelligence exchanges, they're envisaging a partnership which would and should provide for the possibility of intelligence exchanges between the Union and the United Kingdom on a timely and voluntary basis. And then we've got space. This is particularly about the Galileo GPS system. That is a key part of this as well. And finally, development cooperation. And this is the one that's particularly strange, I suppose, because somehow under security, defense, security and foreign policy, we're talking about United Nations development goals and so on. So what's on offer here is definitely an opt-in. Okay, so they're really opening their arms wide to the UK to get involved in European Defence Union to the deepest and broadest extent possible. And so I'm just going to come back to this once again and make the point once again about David Cameron and what he had planned before the referendum. And this was the lead up to the referendum, his agreement with the EU about Britain's future relationship in 2015-2016. The best of both worlds, the United Kingdom's special status in a reformed European Union. And the position of that document was that Britain would remain in the EU but would opt out of certain institutions. And very key to this document was this deeper security and policy. And I've made the point in the past that this is pretty much equal to what we have at the moment, where we have left the EU apparently, but we're opting in to things. Now, of course, at this point, we haven't opted in specifically to much of what is on the table at the moment, but we have opted into other European Defence Union institutions. For example, EI2, we've been highlighting this on a number of occasions. Lord Freddie Howe signed the document which signed us into this. EI2 intends to contribute to the ongoing efforts within the European Union to deepen defence cooperation, notably PESCO. We've made the point that EI2 is a multilateral agreement. It's not an EU agreement, so we haven't made an agreement with the EU specifically, but we have made an agreement with other EU member states. And of course, this forms the left-hand pillar of European Defence Union. And it was interesting that although this is an opt-in, they say very clearly that they want to make use of the existing framework to cooperate with third countries, including through the United Nations and NATO, and of course that is the right-hand pillar of European Defence Union. So what we have here, and maybe get Brian's thoughts and David's thoughts, what we have here absolutely in this proposal for the basis for negotiations between the EU and the UK for the future relationship is an offer by the EU to the UK to absolutely get involved 150% in European Defence Union. We're already involved through other institutions like EI2, but they're wanting to put this into the future relationship agreement, and it's key. It's absolutely key for them, clearly, that foreign policy, security, defence is something they want to get a solution to.
Well, they are desperate. They need the British to stay in because of the strength that we give on defence, Mike. And from our own political side, what don't we see? We don't see a statement that we're having a break on defence. We're actually leaving. This has never been said. All that's been is a denial that anything was happening, and things carried on as normal. So what's coming to the surface now is all these plans behind the back door, and that only does one thing, which is to keep us locked into the EU security and defence programme. Somebody in our chat box has just pointed out that it was Blair and Chirac that actually signed up to the Common Security and Defence Programme in St Malo in 1998. This is a very deep subject which goes right to the heart of the British government, and the public simply not being told the truth.
Yeah, absolutely. So go and look at the Defence Union timeline on the UK Column website. But David, what are your thoughts about this? Because none of this is 50% of what Barnier was proposing, and none of this appeared in the mainstream press.
Yes, the silence goes on. Once again, the mainstream press, the politicians, nobody talks about defence union. And there's 2 points here I'd like to raise. One, timescales. We have a timescale on this. It's to be complete by 2025. That's not very far away. And Britain constitutes 40% of the European defence industrial complex. It does not work without us. they need us, and it looks like they're going to get us as well. And the other thing is, I was struck by the language, future security partnership. I thought that rings a bell. Where's that ring a bell from? Oh yes, we're talking about the future force concept, which is the MOD planning for 10 to 20 years out from the current date. And that talks about the future operating environment. And every development then has future written on it, like the future submarine school at Faz Lane. So it's very strange that the EU are using exactly the same language and exactly the same format as the MOD. Should I be worried?
Well, that's a very good question.
Well, the answer is you should, because if we're in a situation, and we are, where we know that the British government is continuing to deceive, many people would say lie, to the British public over what's happening here, we're in a very, very dangerous situation. And of course, we'll emphasise for new viewers or listeners that if the term security is being used by the European Union, that automatically includes defence, which is all three armed services, plus intelligence services, plus procurement, plus defence industries.
Now, of course, they're very keen that Britain is fully engaged on EU foreign policy, and the question is, what is that foreign policy? And largely, it's about expansion to the east and expansion to the south. So here's Charles Michel, who is currently the president of the EU Council, and he has been over in Africa at the moment in Addis Ababa because the African Union conference is being held there at the moment. And really, his opening remarks were quite spectacular. Your northern neighbour is changing, he said. I'm here tonight, and David, you'll love this. I'm here tonight to speak for 27 European countries. 21 of them never had any colonies. And he went on to say, a new generation of leaders is coming to power. They're not hampered by the burden of nostalgia, because colonialization is about nostalgia, apparently. We want to look towards the future and to our neighbours. We want to tackle climate change and the digital revolution, the two major challenges we're all facing. This changing Europe, he said, is looking at Africa with fresh eyes, with respect, optimism and confidence. Our closeness connects us. Our partnership is a rich one. Everything draws us towards one another, history, geography, culture, and the many exchanges between us. Europe is your partner for trade, investment, cooperation and development, but this partnership is no longer enough. It needs to be reinvented. We must build a new house to accommodate our many common interests, and we must write a new chapter together. So, David, what do you make of that?
Wow, a new house, eh? We had 21 that had no colonies that time. I don't know what with fresh eyes. We're looking at you with fresh eyes. That seems a little creepy to me.
Fresh greedy eyes.
Yes, that's what it says to me. Is greed. Is we want your resources. You know, we've got for example, a plan to introduce battery power everywhere, and that's going to use twice the current annual production of cobalt. Who's got cobalt? And we're going to need some natural resources, and we're going to need your natural resources. So yeah, we're looking at you with greedy eyes, and they talk about the many exchanges in the past. Well, most of those were colonial, for good and for bad, and there was both in there. But we're trying to draw a veil over that. A fascinating little exchange there.
It didn't go down too well with the Africans. But here's Cyril Ramaphosa, who's the current president of South Africa, and he said the Africa Continental Free Trade Area that we adopted last year will enable us to work together through intra-Africa trade, and as it will reignite industrialization and pave the way for Africa's integration into the global economy as a player of considerable weight and scale. So in other words, they aren't really excited about the prospect of the EU coming in and partnering with them in inverted commas. They want to do it on their own. They want to build their own industrial base and be a player in the world economy, which of course is something which the colonial powers and the financial system haven't allowed to happen up until now. So they're not the Africans not necessarily buying what the EU has to sell.
No, and the other thing it's selling, of course, is tariff walls, control from Brussels, and of course vast amounts of environmental legislation which will stop in its tracks any industrial development on the continent of Africa. So yeah, there is a conflict here. I feel sorry for the Africans who just want to build their nations.
Absolutely.
And I've just we know that the Congo in particular is suffering as a result of now this massive industrialization and mining program for materials for the battery technology in Europe. Bizarre.
Okay, if you would like to support the UK column, you can do that by heading over to ukcolumn.org/community. There are various options for supporting us there. Your support is needed and much appreciated.
Indeed. Well, we're lucky to be here because, of course, coronavirus is getting even more deadly in UK. Let's have a look at the Guardian headlines. So, coronavirus, the number of confirmed UK cases rises from 4 to 8. And if you go into the article, it actually says that it's doubled. So it's got the reinforcement. It has doubled from 4 to 8 as the government announced new powers to detain people suspected of having the virus. And this is the key point of UK column reporting this. We've got alarmist reports across the whole of the UK press, but now we're seeing something very, very sinister coming in, which is on the back of that alarmist reporting, the government is seizing more powers, placing basic freedoms of the public at risk. Well, this is the man behind it, Matt Hancock. Slightly nicer picture than maybe we normally show, Mike. But under the measures announced on Monday, the Department of Health said people with coronavirus could now be forcibly detained and sent to isolation if public health professionals believe there's a reasonable risk an individual may have the virus. So this is the hype around the virus, not around what the real facts are. But you can now be picked up and detained. The incidence or transmission of novel coronavirus constitutes a serious and imminent threat to public health. So I'm taking action to protect the public and isolate those at risk of spreading the virus. Clinical advice has not changed about the risk to the public, which remains moderate. So it hasn't changed, it remains moderate, but basically we are going to start detaining people against their will. But it was interesting to see here's Matt Hancock tweeting out, clinical advice has not changed about the risk to the public, which remains moderate. So on one hand, we're saying it's a serious and imminent threat. And on the other hand, he's clearly saying that it's a moderate risk to the public. So lots of confusion here as to what's going on. And where's this leading us? Well, if you want to go and have a look at Public Health England, it gets even more confusing. It says 4 patients in England have tested positive. So Public Health England don't even know how many cases they are as of the present time. If more cases are confirmed in the UK, it will be announced as soon as possible by the Chief Medical Officer of the affected country, which I found quite interesting.
Yes, because we've got 4 countries in the Union now.
Right, okay.
So we've got 4 chief medical officers.
Well, that's good. And then it says, based on the World Health Organization's declaration that this is a public health emergency of international concern, the UK chief medical officers have raised the risk to the public from low to moderate. So we are not driving this as a nation. We are now simply kowtowing to the World Health Organization. And what we're seeing is still alarmist reporting on what's actually happening, but those cases in UK have doubled.
David, what are your thoughts on the way that this is being reported in the press?
Well, I'm astonished that the Guardian got 2 times 4 equals 8. That's way above the normal level. And I would say whoever came up with that needs to be transferred to the economics desk straight away. Now, you guys are making light of this, but let me give you a Scottish perspective on this. Right, coronavirus fears closed Scottish Chinese takeaway after staff quarantine. This is getting serious. The Millfield Kitchens and Chinese takeaway in Arbroath has been closed after one of the staff came back from China and felt unwell. Although, quote, there's no suggestion that they have the virus. So simply now being Chinese and a little under the weather is enough to quarantine the entire staff in this case and start to close essential services like the Chinese restaurant in Arbroath.
Right.
Okay. Righty ho. Okay, now David, let's move on back north of the border. In fact, and of course the story of Derek Mackay. Is it Mackay? I hope it's Mackay, because you know I am a Mackay on my mother's side, and so I hope it is a Mackay there, who apparently has been sending schoolboys dodgy texts.
I'm afraid it's Mackay, and yes, he has been. Actually, he's been sending 270 dodgy texts to this particular schoolboy, who he said was cute, amongst other things. And he said then you can delete that message. And the messages continued. He offered to take the boy to a rugby game, even though he'd no interest. Mackay had no interest in rugby. The boy was interested in rugby, so he offered to take him to a rugby game. He offered to organise a rugby-centred event centred around Parliament. He offered to take him out canvassing. He offered to buy him dinner after the canvassing. This went on and on and on. And he knew he was 16. He saw from that last slide there. So what age are you? 16, right? And on it went. Now, the Scottish Conservatives in Parliament actually called this very accurately, somewhat unusually, but they quoted the NSPCC guide to what is grooming. So the NSPCC's grooming is when someone builds a relationship, trust, and emotional connection with a child or young person so they can manipulate, exploit, and abuse them. That seems to be fairly accurate here. And NSPC goes on to explain how this happens, and it talks about authority figures being involved, social media and networks and text messages being a medium of information being passed around. And it talks about the groomers giving advice, showing understanding, giving attention, taking the young person on trips, outings, holidays, this sort of thing. So all of this, it seemed to be a classic case of child grooming. Now, the mother found out about this last week, and I would have to say she played it exactly right. She didn't go just to Police Scotland. She didn't go to the politicians. She went to the press. She went to the Fourth Estate. They put it on the front page, and Mackay had to go. So she actually played to protect her son. She did exactly the right thing, and that was extremely courageous and good on her. Now that she's done this, of course, there are other stories coming out. Here's one reported in the Daily Record, where a married and heterosexual man caught Derek Mackay's eye, was then bombarded with messages, creepy messages, including asking him if he'd got any naughty pictures. So this went on and on. And of course, Nicola Sturgeon claimed she knew nothing about any of this. It was a shock to her. She never saw any of this coming, despite having actually banned him from drinking at the party conference because of his behaviour some years ago. Not quite sure what the behaviour was. Maybe we'll find out. When the information was brought forward by the Sun, he went to the Scottish Government looking for comment. The Scottish Government weren't exactly shocked. In fact, they tried to essentially suppress the information. So they said, the Scottish Government said, given that you yourself state that there's nothing illegal or unlawful in the messages, which actually wasn't true, it's not what the Sun said, can you advise on your justification for publication, given the intrusion into private and family life and correspondence, including digital communication. So you see the implied threat of law breaking, or you're accessing digital communications here, you could be breaking the law. You see where they're pushing, it's private life. So grooming a 16-year-old boy is private family life in the view of the Scottish Government. And they were asked, was the material obtained by legitimate means? They were asked for the name of the boy, and the Sun didn't give in to any of this pressure and published anyway. The reaction was quite stunning in Scotland. The degree to which people quickly realised that this was part of a bigger malaise in the SNP was very striking. But also the reaction of the kind of true believers within the SNP to defend utterly indefensible was equally striking. The most egregious example is this one on the next slide, where an SNP councillor, so this is someone with likely responsibility to some extent for child protection issues, heard about this, and her view was it's all a nasty British establishment unionist plot. She said, stupid man, probably a honey trap set up by the British establishment, and he has walked right into it. And you've seen people, national supporters, claiming that the boy and the mother didn't exist. It was all essentially MI5. No, I'm sorry. This is a predatory homosexual going after a young 16-year-old boy. That's what it is. We have to face reality here. Now, of the various people who looked at the wider implications, one of the best yet again was the Wee Flea. This is a blog by a minister of the Free Church of Scotland, formerly in Dundee. And he's looking at it as, is this the end of the Scottish government? And I don't think this is hyperbole. This is absolutely existential, because this gets to the heart of everything the Scottish government have been doing. The concentration on children, the concentration on very often 16-year-old children, the whole woke pro-gay agenda, all of this starts to play into this particular little drama. So the Wee Flea said, for a number of years I've been aware, through observation and direct involvement with a significant number of politicians, just how unhappy, confused and corrupt the whole system is. Amen to that. Although on the outward we talk a good game, under the surface there's something rotten in the Kingdom of Scotland. And I suspect that this year that rottenness will manifest itself more and more as different things are exposed. Holyrood is not a happy place relationally. The Scottish political establishment is small and somewhat incestuous. The opportunity to exploit power, curtail the media and use whatever influence you have for personal gain is prevalent in Scotland, as it is everywhere else. The problem is that having decided to jettison Scotland's Christian values, no one seems quite sure what to replace them with, other than the current woke cause of the moment. Values and virtue signalling have replaced virtue. Now, this also plays into the pushing of both the queer agenda and queer theory into schools, and also some very troubling developments where the Scottish government is pushing sexual education of a most alarming nature into schools. So the next video we'll just play in the background. This is from a Dundee school that was one where the Wee Flea blogger had direct involvement. So he speaks of this. He says, this video suggests that the children themselves who are, that it is the children themselves who are leading this sexual revolution, which is as nonsensical as saying that Mao's Little Red Brigades were spontaneous uprisings in favour of the great leader, with nothing to do with him or the Communist Party. The children on these videos are being indoctrinated. They have a shallow and cheap view of love. They have even had their own pupil-led committee to ensure that everyone else is on song. The deputy head teacher and LGBT activist, it's always the case, is responsible for this, along with my old sparring partner, Gregor Murray, the former head of Dundee City Education, who was fired because of his abusive tweets against feminists. Gregor is a radical exponent of queer theory. This leads to confused children and is, in my view, a form of child abuse. And it is a kind of grooming, preparing children for sexual activity in not too later life. The trouble is, as parents told me, if they raise concerns about this, they are frightened of being labelled homophobic or transphobic. Now, this ties in exactly with the experience recently in Birmingham, where it was Muslim but also Christian and Jewish parents who stood up against the education that's been forced on the children, and they were labelled homophobic and transphobic and all the rest of it. Some of the comments on Twitter have been truly excellent on this. I mean, some of the analysis has actually been delivered on Twitter. There's been far in excess of anything coming out of the mainstream press. So here's a thread from Malcolm Clark at Twisted Phil. And it's a long thread, and I've taken a couple of extracts from it. So he says here, he says, it's easy to dismiss this story as just another one about a politician blowing up his career with dodgy behaviour. But if the Scottish government isn't careful, it could become emblematic. For too long, any criticism of its deepening obsession with LGBT issues has been denounced as homophobic, and any concern that's expressed about a failure to take seriously the safeguarding of children is dismissed as bigotry. But maybe Derek Mackay has inadvertently opened a little window into the shared culture of some of the top-level Scottish politicians. Maybe we should ask how seriously they really take the risk to 16-year-olds and other children from some of their key policies. And he then talks about the transgender movement, the 3,000% increase explosion in referrals to the Tavistock Institute, and also a similar, there's a clinic in Glasgow as well that deals with similar issues. They've seen an 80% increase. He goes on, he said, when critics warn Scottish ministers all this is a child safeguarding nightmare, they roll their collective eyes. They've taken advice, they say, but who are their experts? The government has taken advice almost exclusively from a tiny clique of LGBTQ lobby organisations. And when I've asked some of the sources, I've been told the sources are secret. We're not allowed to know where the advice comes from. Stonewall, Equality Network, LGBT Youth, Scottish Trans Alliance form a magic circle of influence. Personnel are best buddies with leading politicians, and by an amazing coincidence, these organisations then obtain huge funding from the same administration their mates run. And he then lists some of the funding. So we've got Trans Alliance, 200,000 this year alone, LGBT Youth, 260,000, and on it goes. It totals something like 2 million over 3 years. So the government pay the lobbyists to lobby the government to make the change. That's how it works. And the change is rapid, and the parents are not being asked. And this brings us to an excellent article by Bruce Scott in the Scottish Review. Now, he's talking about the crisis of consent in Scottish schools. Now, there's two main lines he takes on this. Firstly, he says, exposing children and adults to a spurious ideology. This is the ACE ideology. ACE standing for, I've just blanked on it. It'll come back to me in a moment. ACE aware, adverse childhood experiences, that's it. Adverse childhood experiences, which are meant to dominate the rest of your life. So this is one of the lines to take. So he goes on here. Based on dubious scientific methods, it's a form of abuse or adversity if consent is not obtained. The ACE movement's cry for ACE-aware schools, for example, is effectively a psychoeducational treatment based on theoretical facets of cognitive behavioural therapy, CBT, i.e. resilience indoctrination in schools under the relationship, sex and health education. This programme is nothing more than an inappropriate focusing of a child's mind on their own mind, creating issues where there were none, creating distress in children who do not have the maturity to introspect to such a degree, and manufacturing mental health difficulties due to the iatronic, that is, harmful effects of the treatment or medical intervention, effects of the treatment. Which I think is absolutely spot on and really insightful. He goes on, he said, this brings me to another area where consent and or consultation with parents is being disregarded even further, with plans to roll out LGBT inclusive education in Scottish schools. Supposedly the driving force behind this policy drive in Scotland is the TIE campaign, Time for Inclusive Education in Scotland. But it's in fact a United Nations driven agenda. TIE, along with the Scottish Government and the LGBT Inclusive Education Policy Working Group, are proposing that every aspect of school curriculum from nursery and primary one upwards is to include LGBT focused materials. What's the drive behind that? So he finishes off by saying, children are precious and vulnerable. We must get this right now, rather than realising in 10 to 20 years from now that we've harmed children, no doubt due to reports in the media of psychologists resigning from the Tavistock Gender Clinic in London over worries of pressuring children into gender transition and skyrocketing referrals of 4 to 10-year-olds to gender identity clinics. It may be the tide is turning and people are waking up. More people need to wake up, especially parents. If parents do not fight for their children, who will? Chief Mammy in the Scottish Government? I don't think so. So he's seeing this as a rising tide of state-sponsored abuse, and I think he's absolutely correct. The Highland Times here looks at the sort of sex education materials that are being introduced by the Scottish Government into Scottish schools, and they are horrendous. That's a nice graphic there. That's from their own material. That's from Scottish Government video been shown to amazingly young school children.
And sorry, David, for listeners, that is a banana being dipped in some chocolate spread.
Yes, and it says only 40% of women engage in anal sex. So the Highland Times continues, if you're a parent and already alarmed, I warn you to prepare to be enraged. Schools are currently rolling out a radical new SNP Scottish Government sex education policy. I use the term radical because it's nothing to do with the sex education anyone reading this article will have undergone. When I was at school, in second year science class, I was 12 or 13, I was first introduced to our bits. My class had to wait a whole year to find out what those bits were used for, and it was still taught in the science lab. Now, under the SNP government's new policy, the mood has shifted dramatically to include discussions on genres of pornography, lesbian, interracial, facial, etc., utilising porn and masturbation, paying for a prostitute, oral and anal sex. The accompanying learning materials are extremely graphic and sick. So that's what's been introduced into the schools. We don't see grooming simply by one member of the Scottish Government. We see grooming of children by the entire state, by the SNP, by Scottish Government. And my concern is that this will be the next Rotherham. This will be the next wave of child abuse. And we'll be talking about how do we not see it happening 10 or 20 years from now, when in fact this time, more obviously than ever before, it's the state that is in fact pushing it.
Yeah, perhaps we should add to that, just for particularly viewers and listeners south of the border, that of course the Scottish Government, under its named person scheme, said that the Scottish Government would nominate people to be the guardians of children from conception, I think, certainly from birth. So the same Scottish Government that said it was capable of looking after children, we now start to see what type of agenda the Scottish Government has got, not just planned, it's actually implemented this. So the squashing of the named person scheme, very important step forward.
And just a final word, I call out to the Scottish Family Party, a small political party, embryonic, but they're the people that are leading on this. They are bringing this to public attention, and just a huge thank you to everyone involved in that.
Okay, now let's move on to some good news. Fantastic news, Brian. The F-35, Britain's F-35s have carried out the first night flights, landings on the Queen Elizabeth aircraft carrier. So this is fantastic news. This is Exercise Lightning Fury, which was training over the North Sea, and it was aimed at, according to the government, ensuring 207 Squadron achieves essential carrier flying and landing signals officer supervisory qualifications.
Well, this is very good. I noticed that they've got some high tech, what do we call them, lights on the aircraft, obviously just to snazz it up a bit. I've never seen those before, but it does look very attractive, those green lights.
Well, I'm sure they're red on the other side, but
well, possibly, presumably because it's so difficult to see. We could have a discussion about that. A little while ago, I looked at a YouTube video which was about an English Electric Lightning getting up some vast altitude, about 70,000 feet, in order to do an intercept. So a 50s aircraft which wasn't having any problems with its oxygen supply, clearly.
No, but you'll be glad to know that HMS Queen Elizabeth and HMS Prince of Wales will be the first aircraft carriers in the world to be designed specifically to operate the Lightning jet, which is the F-35. And the short takeoff and vertical landing Lightning represents a step change in capability. With its advanced sensors and stealth technology, the Lightning will provide the UK with a world-beating combat aircraft, which can be jointly manned by the Royal Air Force and the Royal Navy. And so Ben Wallace, our illustrious Secretary of State for Defence, had this to say. He said, few countries in the world have the capacity and technology to deploy fighter jets from an aircraft carrier in the North Sea. These trials put the UK at the helm of fifth-generation warfighting and cement the UK as a tier 1 military power. Well, I'm not certain whether fifth generation war fighting or fifth generation war crashing, because we've highlighted the problems with the F-35. Well, Bloomberg reported at the end of last week that well, or in fact 10 days ago now, that the F-35's gun can't shoot straight. Well, of course, we knew that a year ago but basically, Anthony Capaccio here has managed to see an early copy of the latest US government report into the F-35, but we knew that the gun could shoot straight a year ago in the previous report. But Bloomberg here saying that there are no new major flaws in the aircraft. This is good news. But there are 13 level 1, category 1 must fix issues. There are, 873 software problems, but that's okay because it's down from 917. Okay, in a year, so they're making good progress. The Alice system, which of course is the system which supposedly it's a smart system which drives the flow of maintenance parts. It tells support crews where they need to be, what's scheduled maintenance they need to be doing, makes sure that the correct parts get to the right places, and it makes sure that the health and maintenance action information is sent by that software to each aircraft, so that it supports the entire logistics network. It is no better than it was, so it's not a problem. A long list of less critical problems. The report says, although the Programme Office is working to fix deficiencies, new discoveries are still being made, resulting in only a minor decrease in the overall number of defects, and many significant issues still remain to be addressed. So it's done its first night landing on HMS Queen Elizabeth.
And this is supposed to be a very big thing in 2020 when we were doing it very successfully with the Harrier in appalling conditions quite a few years ago.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, we'll leave it there, but we won't leave defence there because this incredible story appeared in the Mail. It's outrageous. No one went to check on him. Widow blasts army over mysterious death of her soldier husband, 33, who lay dead in his barracks for 3 weeks. I find this one of the most astonishing articles that I think I've read about Britain's military in a great many years because of the implication of what this means. Interestingly, the man concerned, Lance Corporal Munger, was going to go and do a job with 77 Brigade. He had talked about some bullying that had been going on, but we now have got such a stage where the military doesn't even know where its own troops are, not for 1 or 2 days, but after 3 weeks, nobody was still concerned about this man, neither the barracks there where he was, nor where he'd been posted to. So he didn't turn up at his new post and nobody asked where he was.
In the past, if you disappeared for 3 weeks, would you not be declared absent without leave?
Well, this is true, but nothing happened. More importantly, Mike, if you weren't present for 24 hours, somebody would be aware you weren't there. So what is going on inside the military, we don't know, but something very serious here. And we think there are a lot more questions to be asked because we're seeing more and more bizarre things happen as the political climate inside the military changes with equality policies, political correctness, and of course we've seen the approval of Satanism. Right, do this very quickly because we're very short for time, but just a fascinating little glimpse into where we've got with media off the back of this tragic situation where a teenager threw a young boy from the Tate Modern platform, but he told the carers, he had severe mental health issues, he told the carers looking after him he wanted to push someone off a high building a year earlier. Now this was reported on ITV, Good Morning Britain, and we wanted to show you the film clip, but unfortunately we can't because we know that we're now being effectively censored for using other media clip. So we've taken some screenshot, but in this they brought on a panel to talk about what was happening, and this lady, who's an economist, said basically, well, it was nothing to do with a bad decision you were told and you didn't act. This is all to do with the fact the naughty government has stopped money and you haven't got enough money to act. And another panellist, Ian Dale here from LBC, he was so outraged at what the woman said that he walked off the set. in an absolute tantrum. So if I do this very quickly, she said, well, this is a tragic accident. It was all the fault of cutting social services budget, and it leads us back to the austerity agenda by this nasty government. He said that's rubbish, but the next minute he was throwing his toys out the pram, even though the hosts were saying stay and debate this. Meanwhile, this man, Nihal Arthanyaka, who's a 5 Live broadcaster with the BBC, he was the third person on the panel. He was sniggering, and although he did say, well, why don't you just wait and see what else she's got to say, he sniggered as Ian Dale disappeared off the set that he was a West Ham supporter. So if you go and look and see who the panelists were and why they were chosen, this lady, Grace Blakely, is an economist. She's also attached to socialist writing. So this was nothing to do with social services and what really happened. There was an agenda had been set up by ITV. This is her advertising her book on economics. So she's very young, she's done a degree, she's now written a book, but she's brought onto TV. This is Nihal here from the BBC, so it's BBC 5 Live. He gets a snigger in because he picks up a piece of video which shows Ian Dale wrestling with a person who tried to protest when they were doing an outside broadcast. So his point correctly is that Ian Dale can't really speak, because when it comes to censoring people, he got heavy-handed with somebody just holding up a placard to protest while a Sky interview was going on. And this is Ian Dale himself. And he's crowing that on Valentine's evening, he's going to be interviewing Ken Clarke. And I wonder whether he'll be interviewing Ken Clarke about what Mr. Clarke thinks we should be doing to protect our children. But I bet he doesn't. And I'll end by the fact that the Mail, having reported the original tragic story, then gets very hot under the collar that other people are now just talking about money. They're not concentrating on what actually went wrong with social services. Somehow, despite his appalling statement of intent, bravery, the man who did the act was allowed out to commit his terrible crime. It is the most sorry state of care in the community gone wrong. So basically, none of the key questions about what actually happened here have come into the mainstream media. It's gone into a circle of them criticising each other for failing to do their job. Meanwhile, the UK column can't report it properly because we get censored that we've dared to comment on somebody else's video.
Well, it's copyright is the problem, of course, and ITV is pretty aggressive in its copyright maintenance.
Well, it's copyright, Mike, but at the end of the day, if you wish to comment on something somebody's put out and they say, no, we've broadcast this, but you can't comment on it because that's copyright, what you're actually doing is censoring. So there we are. David, 30 seconds before we go.
Okay. Well, it's been a very interesting news. I'm really struck by the most positive thing we managed to say there was that the F-35, if we carry on with the current rate of improvement, will have sorted all of its technical software problems in a mere 21 years. So that's good news. We're seeing the state in its various forms failing to protect and failing to have any real understanding or workable theory of what it is to be a child, what it is to need protection. It's a failure of the most fundamental form, and it needs people of goodwill all around the country to speak out, to act, and to not be cowed anymore by being frightened of being called homophobic or transphobic or bigoted or whatever the slur word is. Speak out, say what you believe, and fight.
Quite. Well, the UK column will keep going. I'd just like to say we are sent gifts from time to time. We got this excellent mug, Keep Calm and Carry On, came in a beautiful package with a very sentimental silhouette of my former Cocker Spaniel. These gifts are appreciated. It's very kind. Thank you for joining us, and we'll be back at the same time on Wednesday. Bye-bye.